Hello and welcome to our dining area. I have some new artwork. This project took me so long to complete because I am not a professional artist, but it was really fun to do and I like how everything turned out eventually. Even though during the process there were times when everything seemed like it was going to end up terrible. So this project came about because I was tired of the old artwork and ready for something new. And when we first moved into this house about almost 3 years ago, I wanted something up on this wall because I didn't want it to just be a blank empty wall. So I just bought some cheap frames from IKEA and painted some simple ferns and threw them up there. The ferns were okay, but they weren't my favorite. And I just kind of wanted to switch them out for something a bit more interesting. And then I recently started liking the look of gallery walls. But I didn't want to have to go and buy all new frames because these ones were perfectly good. So I decided to mimic the look and feel of a gallery wall by putting multiple pieces of artwork within each frame. So the first thing that I did was I looked on Pinterest for artwork that I thought was pretty and also that I thought I had a relatively good chance of being able to paint. Because again, I'm not a professional artist. I really enjoy it, but I don't really have any training other than taking 4 years of art in high school and just dabbling in art throughout the years. And I'm not particularly talented. Like, I can obviously put paint on some paper, but I know my limits. So I stayed away from anything that looked too realistic or too difficult, and I tended to stay with more abstract stuff because I figured I would have a better chance of being able to replicate abstract work than something that looks super realistic or super detailed. So once I picked out a bunch of artwork that I liked from Pinterest, then I played around with how I could style them and compose them into these 3 frames. So I played around with cropping images and changing the dimensions and rotating them. Some of the images I flipped, some of them I adjusted the hue or the saturation to try and make it all into one cohesive gallery. So when I was putting together the images and composing them, I considered 4 main factors: content, style, color, and size. And I think it looks visually pleasing to keep some factors relatively uniform and some not uniform. So in my case, I kept the content and the color relatively uniform, but then I mixed up the style and the size. So in my case, I wanted to keep all of the content nature-based because I just think it looks really pretty and it goes well with the rest of our house. So I have lots of plants and a bird and rocks and a landscape, but then I varied the style because I wanted to keep it interesting. So some of them are more simple and abstract, others are more detailed and realistic, although none of them are that realistic. I have some that are like macro, some that are landscape, some that have a single object, and others that are more complex. Then I really wanted to have a cohesive color palette because I think it helps all of the different pieces of artwork go well together. So in my case, the main colors were muted blues and pinks and ochre yellows / greens. And when I was putting together the images, I wanted to balance the colors and the white areas. So for example, I knew that I didn't want the bird and the cloud landscape to go next to each other because those have big blocks of color. And I also wanted to space out where the colors were. So here we have blue in the rocks, blue in this vegetation scene, and then blue on that far side. And same thing with the pinks in the cloud landscape and the vegetation and in this little plant right here. And then finally, I think an important component of any gallery wall is having different size images. Initially, I was thinking of just doing 6, 2 per frame, but that just felt really boring. And then once I introduced some smaller images, I feel like it just made it more visually interesting. Obviously, buying a bunch of prints and images is going to be a lot easier and faster, but there are some nice things about being able to create your own artwork, such as being able to tweak the images to make them more personal to you. So here's some time-lapse of me painting and my thought process for each image. So I wanted to start with the most difficult piece first, which in my opinion was this one. And I also wanted to start with it because it was like the central piece that had all of the colors that tied in all of the other paintings. So I knew once I had the colors down for this painting, I would be able to somewhat match the colors in the other paintings to this one. I definitely struggled the most with this painting, and when I was done with this one, I actually wasn't that satisfied with it. So I painted it 2 more times before I finally ended up with a version that I was happy with. And I did not record that attempt, but here's a photo of how the final painting turned out. I thought the inspiration piece for this one was so pretty, and I tried my hardest to replicate it, and I was not completely successful, but I'm pretty happy with how mine turned out anyways. Then I moved on to the painting that I thought would be the next most difficult, which was this cloud landscape. When I was going through Pinterest, there were several landscapes that caught my eye, but in the end I decided to do this one because 1, it was relatively simple, and 2, it was more of an acrylic style rather than watercolor, and I wanted some variety in the style of paintings. This one was quite fun to paint and not stressful. I just blended out a pink sky and then put in the foreground, and then once the sky was dry, I went in with some white acrylic paint and painted on some fluffy white clouds. It was also a nice addition to my nature theme without being heavily plant-based because most of the other paintings are centered around plants. Next were the banana leaves, and I first lightly sketched out the shape of the leaves with a pencil, and I'm also referring to the reference photo on my phone. When I saw a painting of a banana leaf, I knew I wanted to include it in this gallery wall because banana plants remind me of when TJ and I got married. In traditional Thai weddings, the groom's family brings presents to the bride's family, including 2 banana plants and 2 sugarcane plants. So after the wedding, we brought our baby plants home and we planted them in our backyard. It took them over a year to finally produce fruits, but when they did, we ended up with a ton of bananas, and they were so sweet and yummy. And now I have this painting of banana leaves to remind me of our wedding. The next painting that I did was the bird silhouette, and again you can see me looking at my reference photo. And in the reference photo it was just a generic bird, but in this case I wanted to make it more personal and have more meaning to us, and so I replaced their generic bird silhouette with a silhouette of a drongo. Drongos are tropical birds with really long tail feathers. I love the ragged-tailed drongos, but I decided to go with a species that is commonly found in our neighborhood, and we often see them perched on power lines or foraging on bugs in the evenings. Next is the rock painting. So I just sketched out some simple rock shapes with a pencil. Then I mixed my colors that I would be needing. I used 2 shades of blue and a shade of ochre yellow. And this was my most traditional watercolor, where I built up light layers of color until I achieved the desired result. You can see me using a hairdryer to speed up the drying process in between each of the layers. This was another painting that I chose because I wanted it to fit in with the nature theme, but again, I didn't want every single painting to be about plants. And I really liked the colors and composition of this one. And this was a really fun painting to work on because it was so forgiving. It's pretty impossible to mess this one up. I did not do a practice for this one. This was my first attempt, and I loved how it turned out. Next was the line art of a branch with flowers and leaves and flower buds. Before I started this one, I practiced drawing flowers from all angles, which you can kind of see on the brown pieces of paper above me. So I put them there so I could use them as a reference for when I drew the final version. And I just sketched everything out with a pencil before going over it with a black marker. I saw several line drawings on Pinterest that I liked, but I decided to personalize it by choosing a plant species that is special to me. This is Bauhinia purpurea, or the orchid tree, and we have a ton of them lining the entranceway into our neighborhood. And when we first started house hunting and came to this neighborhood, they were all in bloom, and it was so beautiful. And I fell in love with this species. So when we first moved into our house here, TJ and I went to a plant nursery and bought a baby bauhinia tree. In Thai, we call it chongko. And we planted it in our front yard, and it has grown so much. And not only are the flowers really beautiful, but I think the shape of the leaves is really pretty too. The fifth painting that I did had these cascading leaves coming from the top left corner, but I actually found it easier to paint rotating it 180 degrees. This was another painting where I did some practice runs that I did not film, and then I filmed this one, and I actually didn't like it as much as one of my previous practice attempts, so I ended up not using this version and using my earlier practice attempt in the final gallery wall. But again, I chose this one just because it looked simple and it brought nice variety to the rest of the artwork. And the last painting that I did, which I saved for last because I figured it would be the easiest, was this simple little plant. The inspiration photo was a lavender color, but I wanted it to be this orangey pinky color to match with the rest of my paintings. And this one was super simple. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just kind of sketched out some leaves. And I wanted this one to have rough edges and look a little less polished than some of the other pieces. So this one was really simple, and I think it turned out pretty cute, especially next to the painting of the rocks. So that's everything, and I hope this video gave you guys some ideas or inspiration for your own art projects. Bye!